Well, today we're going to discuss a hotly debated topic, and I'm sure that this is going to create some level of discomfort among some portion of my audience. But let's have the discussion anyway, and feel free to put a comment in the comment section. In fact, it's going to be to the benefit of this video if you put a comment in the comment section, because today we're going to talk about something that's very subjective, admittedly, and that is who had the best styling of the domestic auto companies in the 1960s. Now, many would say that the 1960s were peak styling for the domestic automakers because this was really before a lot of bumper standards and regulations came into play that would significantly impact vehicle styling beginning in the early 1970s and continuing on for a number of years. Then as we go to today, you have beyond just overall regulations and standards, you have the need for automakers to achieve various aerodynamic targets so that they can have great fuel efficiency on their vehicles. And this leads to, in some ways, many vehicles having a similar shape. Well, first of all, it seems like everybody wants an SUV basically today or some form of a truck. And when you have this very tall and boxy structure to design around, it's pretty hard to get a lot of form into that, just given the limiting factor of the packaging. But beyond that, the front ends of today's vehicles all have to have this taper from the plan view or bird's eye view to help manage the airflow around the vehicle, and also have to have their surfaces specifically engineered to reduce aerodynamic drag. But back in the 60s, those things weren't a consideration because fuel prices were cheap and gas was plentiful. And of course, there were big engines under hood, and also people weren't trying to drive 100 miles an hour in the right lane on the freeway and mow down anybody who was going less than that speed. In any case, in the 1960s, like I said, many would consider that kind of peak styling for the domestic auto industry. And who, should we say, had the best styling of the auto companies during that era? Well, hopefully you put a comment in the comment section, but I'm going to give you my answer, and that is General Motors. Now, why would I say General Motors? Well, there's a number of reasons, and I could even point probably to some specific divisions within General Motors. I think that Pontiac in particular had some of the best looking vehicles inside and out in the mid-1960s of all the General Motors divisions. And you really had this combination of great divisional management, like John DeLorean at the time, coupled with great engineering. The chief engineer for Pontiac during that time was Steve Malone, and the assistant chief engineer was a gentleman by the name of Bill Collins, who would later be poached by DeLorean when DeLorean would start his own motor car company, and Bill Collins was actually the first chief engineer on the DeLorean. Bill Collins also was the chief engineer for a pretty funky motorhome with a BMW diesel engine called the Vixen that was sweet indeed. So there was a lot of great talent on the general management side and on the engineering side from Pontiac. And on the design side, the designs were headed by an individual named Jack Humbert. Now, Jack Humbert was a true talent in automotive design. He would later rise to a more senior position where he was in charge of multiple divisional studios. But at this time, he was in charge of Pontiac Studios, and he actually was originally an interior designer prior to becoming an exterior designer and being placed in charge of Pontiac Exterior Studio. And perhaps that gave Jack and his team this attention to detail to the vehicles that really just was pervasive on the inside and out. So some of the factor behind General Motors having what I would say the best design was really the talent. Now, General Motors obviously had other divisions with very talented chief stylists, but I think Jack was really the top of the notch. And another thing that really made General Motors styling great when you compare it to Ford as an example was that one could say that both Ford and General Motors had talented stylists. In fact, many stylists that worked at Ford as well as Chrysler actually began their careers at General Motors. That was where it started because General Motors launched automotive styling, and that was done by Harley Earl. So they had an early jump on both Ford and Chrysler from a talent perspective, and consequently ended up cross-pollinating a number of designers who would later become and rise to chief positions at Ford and Chrysler. Now, another reason why General Motors was, I think, arguably the best at the styling was that they employed, when it came to the sculpting area of their studios, only individuals who were trained in the fine arts. You had to have a degree in fine arts to be a sculptor at General Motors. Whereas at Ford, for example, their chief sculptor was actually an engineer, not somebody who was trained in the fine arts. And one of the things that's the hardest, I think, aspect of design, maybe not the hardest, but one of the hardest aspects of a design is translating a two-dimensional sketch to three-dimensional surfaces. And that's the work of the designer in partnership with a clay modeler. And as, like I said, at General Motors, the clay modelers all had fine arts degrees. That's where they came from. Whereas at Ford, modeling was just very different. It was more technical. It was more based in engineering and using templates and having, you'll notice a lot of Ford vehicles have relatively simple surfacing at the time compared to General Motors that has more complex surfacing. And the other thing I would encourage you to look at when you go to a car show that has General Motors cars, Ford cars, Chrysler vehicles, I won't forget AMC either, of the 1960s, is walk around the car and take a look at how the reflections move and change on the vehicle as the light moves around it, given that you're walking around the vehicle. You'll find that the GM cars have, let's just say, more liquid-like reflections to them in general, and that's because these fine artists were really using their skills under the lights in the design studios to make sure that each surface was so exact and so correct that it would have the right level of reflection. In contrast, you see a lot of Fords that have, like I said, more simple surfacing and what designers would often call drag section surfaces, which you can imagine if you just have a clay surface and you have a template, you just drag the template across the clay and you form this surface that basically just goes all the way down it in a similar fashion. Let's look at a few examples of vehicles now. Let's take a look at a few more vehicles and explain this in more detail. So a perfect example of a drag section here would be the section of the body side that's below that molding on the body side, the lower body molding. And notice that it kind of curves inward to the area below the molding. And basically you can imagine if this car were made of clay, that you had a template and you just dragged it across that area from the front wheel to the back wheel and shaved off a bunch of clay. That's a so-called drag section. You'll also notice that you could almost say the same for much of the surfacing of the front fender, that you almost could have a template for the whole fender and just drag it across the clay to form that somewhat barrel shape to the fender, as well as the fender peak, and then that lower section that I called the drag section before. And another example here during the Jean Bourdonnais era of Ford design, this would be a so-called fill-the-box design, if you will, from Ford. In other words, that Fords often had very flat fenders and not much, let's say, lead-in to them, or an edge that really just gradually rose. They often had this very pronounced flat fender look, and in some cases a flat belt line, especially as Jean Bourdonnais styling evolved into the 1980s on cars like the Lincoln Mark VI. But Jean Bourdonnais, who led Ford styling at the time, actually had a rule that basically precluded designers from having a rising belt line, so much so that that was one of the reasons why the Ford Escort in the early 80s was different in the U.S. than in Europe. Bourdonnais just did not think that a rising belt line was going to be the right style for the domestic market. So there's a lot of these kind of design tendencies also that start to come out when you look at various designs from the same automaker. Now here's a rear three-quarter view of the 72 Marquis that I was showing before again. I'm showing it here so you can see that drag section again below that side molding, the body side molding. And again, something that would just be made with a template as you dragged it across. And very simple surfacing here. Now, I was admittedly showing a 1970s vehicle, and we're talking about the 60s styling here, but I wanted to demonstrate the point on the drag sections. But here is a 1969 Lincoln Mark III, and you can see some of those typical Ford design elements, the very flat fenders and quarters, and really not much arc to the belt line, not much lead-in on the front, relatively slab-sided on the sides. There are some interesting wheel arches here that kind of gradually taper as they go to the rear edge of the wheel, and there's some interesting surfacing, but overall, the Mark III is a pretty simple design, and there's not that much when it comes to the complicated surfacing of it, particularly on the body side. But let's contrast this now with a General Motors vehicle of the 1960s, this 1965 Bonneville. Now here on the Bonneville, you can see there's a lot more visual surfacing and interest, shall we say. First of all, look at the hood and how complicated it is with that peak, if you will, that forms the Pontiac Arrowhead. And also look at the fenders. The tops of them have this feature line, kind of a radius that runs all the way down the back of the fender that creates some beautiful reflections. Again, take a look at the reflections in this picture versus the reflections in the picture of the Mark III that I just saw. This has a lot more visual interest in how it's reflecting the light. Even the way that the hood has this beautiful lead-in, it kind of tapers off toward the front edge and creates its own reflection there. It's not just flat like some of the Fords are of the era. Now, if you look at the fender, you have a number of feature lines. You have that peak feature line, you have another one that's further down, and then you have another feature line that is kind of halfway down the fender that goes down the line of the car. You also don't have a so-called drag section here. Notice that lower portion of the vehicle isn't just a simple surface that you could drag a template across. It's moving in and out, particularly as it, let's say, goes by the rear wheel. Notice that is moving outward. The body is flaring outward. It's also flaring upward, kind of out and up, the so-called Coke bottle styling that typified some General Motors designs of this era, as well as others. But this is not a surface that you could create by just dragging a template across it. This had to be hand modeled. And look at the reflections and how the light breaks in that area in the rear. Let's actually look at a rear three-quarter view and we can see it a little bit better. Now this is a great view because there's some snow on the ground here and it's providing some reflections on the vehicle. And you notice that there's a feature line that runs the length of the car that's reflecting the snow, and above that, it's not being reflected. So the surfacing is creating some visual interest in terms of what it is actually reflecting. You'll also notice that beautiful bright work, the rocker moldings on this Bonneville, that help give this, I'll call it, slimming effect to the body side. They make it look thinner than it actually is by distracting the eye and making it think that only the painted part of the body side is really the entire vehicle. An innovative way to shrink the midsection of the car. And then as that, let's say that bright work goes rearward, it becomes thinner and there's a bit more chunkiness to the rear and heft, just to show that that rear has some dimension associated with it. You can see that beautiful flare up and outboard at the rear door going to the rear wheel. And again, just look at the overall reflections and surfacing of the body side of this car compared to the Mark III. Both of these pictures are taken on sunny days with polished cars, and you'll notice that it's just a lot more visual interest in terms of what the surfaces reflect on the General Motors vehicles. Again, I would attribute at least part of this to the fine artists that were sculpting the GM cars, really sweating some of the details on the surfaces. And not that the Ford team didn't, but they just thought about surfacing differently and modeling differently from the General Motors team. Let's contrast this Bonneville with another 1960s Ford, my 68 Marquis. Now, after you've seen that photo of the Pontiac, it's kind of hard to look at this Marquis and not think that the surfacing is pretty simple. There's just not that same level of visual interest. You have kind of this dull feature line that runs the length of the car, similar to the Pontiac, but it's not casting the light as differently as the Pontiac was. It's just not as pronounced of a radius. It's a more dull feature line. And there's not too much else in terms of the visual interest on this Marquis. You have, again, the very flat-fendered and quartered look that you'll see on a lot of Fords. The deck lid just is a simple plain surface versus on the Pontiac, it has that middle feature line that runs the length of the deck lid. And it's just an overall more simple surface. Here's another example of my 67 Mercury Park Lane, and you see the same thing. Notice the reflections on the side of the body. This is a sunny day and a freshly waxed car. You just don't see the same visual interest that you saw on the Pontiac. And the styling overall here is, let's say, more architectural too. Not only do you have the flat fendered and quartered look, but you also have this very stiff upper on the vehicle that would get revised for 1968. But Ford had this period that it had very stiff uppers in the mid-1960s. Chrysler kind of went through a little bit of that phase as well. But GM just had something that it was able to do effectively with the uppers as well as the lowers on these three-box design cars. Three-box meaning you've got the front, the back, and the midsection, all very distinct pieces, as opposed to a fastback design where it's really a two-box where you have a front and then kind of one shape for the rear. Now let's contrast that with yet one more photo of what I think is one of the most supremely designed cars by General Motors. That's the 68 and 69 GTO. And why is that? I mean, a lot of people know about the GTO because of its performance, and maybe some even know about the Endura front bumper that was introduced during these years. But take a look at the reflections in the body side as well as the hood on this vehicle. It looks like it's almost a black lake, like a pool of water. And they are absolutely gorgeous. On top of that, this is one of the cars that you really almost can't photograph it appropriately because it's a so-called wasp waist car where the midsection with the doors is relatively narrow, and then the body flares out around the rear wheel, which you can kind of see in this photo, as well as the front wheel. And when you're seeing it in person, those flares and the overall surfacing as you walk around the car just makes these reflections come alive. You didn't see that on the other Ford vehicles that we talked about. And yes, this is a coupe, and I obviously showed some sedans for Ford. I did show a 68 Marquis and a 69 Mark III. But even the Ford coupes like the XL or you pick it, they just didn't have this level of visual interest. So what do you think? Am I off base here? I'm not saying that Ford vehicles are ugly. I own a ton of Fords and I love them. But I do think that the surfacing and the visual interest on the General Motors vehicles of the 1960s was just a level above the others. And I didn't necessarily put a bunch of photographs for Chrysler, but I would say the same about the Chryslers as well. In fact, Chrysler's chief stylist during this period, Elwood Engel, actually came from Ford immediately prior to becoming the chief stylist at Chrysler. And that's part of the reason why some of the 60s era Chryslers look like the 1961 Continental, these very stiff sides, because Engel was the chief designer of that 61 Continental, and it was a seminal design. So similar thoughts apply there when you contrast the Chrysler vehicles versus the GM cars too. Now I will say, taking a look at the 67 Belvedere, while it does have some pretty stiff profile, let's say, lines associated with it, it does have a beautiful reflection there. Notice how the reflection displays this taper as it goes along the side of the car. You don't necessarily see that on the Ford. So I think even Chrysler had a bit more surface development than Ford did at the time. Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.